Hello there! The first thing I'd like to do in this video is to thank Mrs. Bohatkiewicz for a chance to make this video. The topic of my presentation is the most important thing ever invented according to my beliefs. The thing I want to tell you about is probably unusual, because most people would talk about a wheel or a steam engine, but I'm going to talk about space rockets. I'll talk about my choice in a moment, but first I'd like to explain some things. Firstly, that's not going to be a video in any way connected to the standards of Matura exam. Nor it'll be a boring video where I just stand in front of a whiteboard and draw some pictures while explaining. I want this video to contain a lot of information explained in an interesting and fun way. If I would just make a presentation in PowerPoint or Prezi, that wouldn't teach others anything. But aeronautics is my passion. And that's why I've decided to put 10 times more effort in this video than just make some slides with pictures and some text with font 8 that explains nothing. So if we have this explained, I hope you will enjoy the rest of the video. However, keep in mind that there were many revolutionary inventions throughout the ages, and while my choice may not be the most important right now, it could provide itself to be in the future. I think we all know Earth isn't going to last forever. Each year hundreds of small objects collide with Earth. Most are harmless and the dangerous ones tend to land where no humans live. But why is that important? On the 15th of February 2013 in Chelyabinsk, Russia, at 9:20 am local time, a small asteroid about 20 meters wide entered the Earth's atmosphere and exploded after slightly more than 30 seconds of flight, about 30 kilometers above the ground. Its shockwave shattered all windows in the city and injured around 1,500 people. And that piece of rock was only 20 meters wide. Not far away from Earth are rocks kilometers in diameter. And studies show they hit our planet every 500,000 years or so. But even if we are lucky, and that doesn't happen in the span of the next few billion years, the Sun will render Earth inhospitable because of star evolution processes I'm not paid enough to explain. In short, the planet you call home will die, and while there is a lot of time, if we don't prepare, it might already be too late. But let's quit with this nihilistic point of view. Spaceships have other uses than letting us survive and settle other planets before our home gets destroyed, and we are all reminded that we will die one day and nothing we do will matter on a cosmic scale. The thing is, spaceships allow us to send technology to places we could never comprehend, expand our knowledge about the universe, our solar system, our home, even improve our lives. This does sound kind of idealistic, doesn't it? What about an example then? Have you heard about TVs? Nowadays they use electromagnetic waves sent from satellites in orbit to let you watch your favorite shows. But considering the state of Polish TV, that might not be such a good thing. What about GPS? You've probably used it. Same principle, but it's actually useful. What I'm trying to say is that spaceships can help and interest everyone. And I'll show you why. Here's some basic concepts about how spaceships work. I bet you've been at campfire at least once in your life. You could see how the burning wood was just evaporating. But in fact, it wasn't. Wood is made mostly from carbon, which loves to dance with oxygen in a reaction called combustion, which creates carbon dioxide and carbon oxide. Yes, those are different. If that's a problem, go ask electrons to spin the other way. Knowing that, if we put wood and oxygen inside a fireproof hermetic box and started a fire, we wouldn't see much, because oxygen would get combusted really fast. But if we slowly added more of it, we could see how the carbon gets turned into a gas increasing pressure inside the box until it eventually blows up. This happens because gas molecules are shy introverts, like me, and don't like being around other molecules. So using their electron shells, they repel each other as far away as possible, unlike the extroverted solids. Now, if we waited a moment, we would see that as temperature decreases, the pressure goes down. It's because molecules with more energy repel each other stronger than with less of it. This is basically how rockets work. To a combustion chamber we insert fuel, usually hydrogen, and oxidizer, that in liquid-fueled rockets almost always is pure oxygen. When the combustion starts, hydrogen and oxygen create water, a lot of heat, and start to repel each other more and more. After that, water molecules enter the special nozzle and escape the rocket. So, what accelerates the rocket itself? The escaping water molecules and Newton's third law of motion. I know everyone has heard the famous sentence, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. In practice it means that if the rocket throws down a highly pressurized gas, the gas throws the rocket with equal force pointed up. And that's how rockets leave the Earth's atmosphere and achieve orbit. Except for liquid-fueled rockets, we also have solid-fueled rockets, fueled by ballistite or cordite. But they all use the same laws of motion. Every one of you had something very similar in your hands. Except for you, it didn't work because of a chemical reaction. You had to put the pressure in it by yourself. So if you really wanted to, you could call a rocket a big, highly complicated balloon. But to achieve orbit, it has to accelerate enough to achieve so-called first cosmic velocity. For Earth it's exactly 7.9 kilometers per second, and it means that if you want to stay in orbit, you have to achieve that speed. Then it can work on achieving the second cosmic velocity and leave the planet it's orbiting. For Earth, this speed is exactly 11.2 km per second. There are also third and fourth cosmic velocities for leaving the solar system and the galaxy, but we don't need to know about them yet. There are a lot of other things to describe and I'd love to do that, but I don't feel like making a 9-hour tutorial for beginners right now. You can also find a lot of materials on official NASA and ESA YouTube channels. Now let's describe the most important thing in this video. That is the history of spaceflight. Our story begins in ancient China. Most historians speculate that fireworks were invented there in the 2nd century BC. They were just sticks of bamboo exploding in a fire because of overheating air holes. But from 600 to 900 AC, something has happened once again in China. A local alchemist mixed together charcoal, sulfur and something called potassium nitrate, a really strong oxidizer. Here you have shown how it works with normal cooking sugar. You can use it to make rockets yourself at home and there's a lot of videos about it already. So go and watch them, so the judge won't blame me. What this man has created was the first black powder. This powder put in a bamboo stick and fired created the first firework, also being the first solid-fueled rocket in history. And soon enough, the world found out about it. It looked something like this. For centuries, nobody really cared for building rockets, at least not on a big scale. There were of course hot air balloons made by Montgomery brothers and then famous Zeppelins. And then, one day on the 17th of December 1903, the Wright brothers from the Ohio in the United States showed to the world the first ever machine heavier than air able to fly. They've used a lot of innovations and found a way to connect everything in a way that has resulted in the first ever known aeroplane called a Wright Flyer. And even though their flight lasted only 12 seconds, they've successfully brought us the era of aviation. It resulted in the first ever airline company opening in 1919, just 16 years from the first ever takeoff. But in the meantime, some World War took place. And it wasn't anything nice. However, it really helped with aircraft design. And the fact that human beings were finally able to fly above other humans' heads inspired new scientists to work on improving technologies that would help take humans to the skies. First of which to succeed was Robert Goddard, the first man who built a liquid-fueled rocket and launched it on the 16th of March 1926. His rocket accelerated to almost 100 km per hour and got to a height of 12 meters in just 2 seconds. From that moment, many people experimented with different rockets and liquid propulsion. Some of them were young German students. One such student was called Werner von Braun. In 1942, a group of Germany's military officers went on a private rocket launch. The rocket failed, but the military was very impressed, especially with the youngest group member. That was Werner von Braun. But let's start from the beginning. In today's Poland, under German occupation since the partitions of the 18th century, in a town called Wieritz, inside an administration building, Powiat Starosti of Wierzysk, where Baron Magnus von Braun lived, little Werner came to this world. Young von Braun was a very smart boy. He loved watching the night sky with his telescope he got from his mother when he was 13. He also loved a book called Die Rakete zu den Planeten Räumen, written by Hermann Oberth, an Austro-Hungarian engineer of German nationality, that von Braun will later be an assistant of. Young Werner was really smart and often teacher used him to talk about specific subjects instead of them. He decided to join German Rocket Association when he was 17 and started publishing theoretical works on liquid rocket propulsion. Soon, when he was 20, the scene from 1932 takes place, and from that moment on, von Braun uses government fundings to develop new rocket technology. He gets his master's degree at just 21 years old and starts to work for Germany's rocket program. The problem was, in 1933 Adolf Hitler became Germany's chancellor, and the Nazi party took control. Von Braun knew who he now worked for. He didn't agree with the politics of the Nazis, but they had the money, and were the only ones willing to give it to him for further rocket developments. If he wanted to achieve his dreams about spaceflight, he had to agree to work for the Nazis. He ended up in Peenemünde, where he developed rocket engines for weapons and new ways of aircraft propulsion. He became the director of the entire complex as soon as he showed up. You might ask, why did the Nazis and the earlier government wanted von Braun to develop rocket for military purposes? The answer is that after World War I, Germany was forbidden from having any kind of military planes, and the new rocket technology was really promising as a long-range weapon of destruction. In 1937, von Braun had a choice. He could join the Nazi party himself or lose all his funding. He decided to join. In 1940, the story repeats, but this time the SS wanted him in their ranks. Once again, he accepted. In 1944, a new type of weapon arrived on the battlefield. The Germany V-1 rocket was a serious threat for the Allies in World War II. but they soon found out how to destroy them. One of the tactics was to fly next to a rocket and then lift one of its wings with a wing of your own plane. This way the rocket would lose direction awareness and fall down before hitting a city. The new miracle rocket was the V2. Built and designed by Werner himself, nicknamed the real Wunderwaffe. Unable to be shot down while crashing into the streets of London, the first successful prototype was launched on the 13th of June 1942, but after flying less than 1.5 kilometers, it exploded. Soon after, on the 3rd of October, a fully successful launch without any obstacles took place. And by 1944, the rocket started regularly falling on London. This was the price for the ambitions of a young genius. Even if he didn't want to harm anybody, the world he lived in didn't allow him to achieve his ambition this way. If you still don't believe me that he wasn't just another Mengele doing his experiments, then I hope the fact that he was arrested by the Gestapo will change your mind. What did he do? At one of the parties he said that the war for Germany meant only another defeat, and that he didn't become a rocket engineer just to kill people, but to send them to space beyond human understanding. He was released 2 weeks later because he was the only person able to work on the rockets Germany needed so much. With every week it was becoming clearer and clearer that they were going to lose the war. With the Red Army in the east and the US Army liberating France in the west, Germany once again was fighting a war on all fronts. On the 2nd of May 1945, he and his team of 115 people hid all the important papers instead of destroying them like they were ordered to, and escaped from the incoming Soviet army to the US one. If they would have been caught, the SS would have killed them all. Fortunately, they found a US Army patrol and surrendered to them. Von Braun was taken to the US, where he'd become one of the greatest engineers of all time, thanks to the paperclip program created to safely transport ex-German scientists to the USA, where they would work for the American government. A fun fact is that, ironically, the second largest group of people brought to America were Jewish scientists. This part of the video was meant to contain an offensive joke. However, because of the ethical reasons, we've decided to cut it out in order to not offend anyone. The creator of the joke vanished in a chase that took place in Jambul region in southeast Kazakhstan. Anyone who has any information about where the author of the joke can be now is asked to report to the closest police station. At first, when he got there, he wasn't so enthusiastic. The US government wasn't keen on spacecraft of any kind. Instead, they wanted him to once again work on deadly weapons. They have ordered von Braun to build ballistic missiles of intercontinental range. Even if he built a space rocket able to put a man-made satellite in orbit around Earth, the government wouldn't allow him to send it into space because it wasn't American enough. And they didn't want journalists writing about a Nazi engineer as the first one to build a rocket on American soil. In 1946, one of the few scientific missions that took place on the sands of New Mexico was proposed by two rocket engineers, J. L. Hennig and Clyde Holliday, put a camera onto a V2 rocket, and this shot the first ever recording of Earth from space. The media were delighted and amazed. The rocket was moving away from Earth with over 1.2 kilometers per second. The footage was made on an altitude about 100 kilometers above Earth's surface and showed the curvature of Earth for the first time. A lot of articles were titled "The Copernicus was right." But as I said, nothing much was happening except for some fruit flies into space until something big happened in 1957. Let's look at the world map of that time for a moment. You can see the United States, the most powerful country in the world, with the most powerful army and atomic bombs. And poor USSR, with a dictatorship regime that after World War II expanded its sphere of influence and took half of Europe as a trophy. Now, it's obvious that the US will crush the Soviet Union on any occasion. But it so happened that this poor country, with people dying every day from starvation, was the first one to send an object into orbit. The USA was in panic. USSR put the first man-made satellite into orbit. They've lost the space race against what they thought of at the time as the biggest third world country in the world. And if that wasn't bad enough, the rocket that put it there was based on the first ballistic intercontinental rocket in the world, R-7. The US was losing the space race against the Soviets, who had nuclear weapons and were the largest country in the world. Remember Von Braun? Yeah, this guy that had to work on a US military program. His work resulted in the PGM-11 rocket called Redstone. He didn't want to build a weapon of terror again, but he still had no choice. Since the Soviets put the first satellite into orbit, everything has changed. From that onwards, he would have to work on putting US satellites into it. He tweaked a few things in his Redstone rocket and made it able to propel an object into orbit. It resulted in the first American satellite, Explorer 1, being sent into space on the 1st of February 1958. But by the time it was sent, the USSR had already achieved something more. I'm talking about the second Soviet satellite in space, Sputnik 2, and his passenger, a dog we know today as Laika. But in fact it wasn't her name. Laika is a race of the dog. Laika played a significant role in space exploration. However, if we look closer at her history, it's very sad. At first there were 10 dogs all brought to the laboratory from the streets of Moscow. Scientists said that this will make the dogs more capable of experiments. All of the dogs had to be white, so they would present themselves well on the recordings. Laika was put in a special chamber to simulate her behavior in space. The tests were taking more and more time until they lasted for 22 days. Laika wasn't the best. Scientists said she was average. They had their favorite candidate for the first dog on orbit, but she got pregnant, so scientists decided to send Laika instead. It's cruel, but Laika was sent to a one-way trip to space. She died 7 hours after launch, probably from overheating. However, even if she survived longer, she would have been served a rat poison. Her body was orbiting around the Earth for the next few months until it burned re-entering Earth's atmosphere. Sending a dog straight to its death wouldn't make for a good PR for the Soviets. So they've told the world that Laika lived for a couple of days and then died out of sepsis. The truth about her death was released in 2002. But even if she was treated this way, she has shown us something. She showed us that it is possible for organisms to survive in space. Even though Americans were testing animal strength earlier, as I mentioned, they were sending fruit flies into space, but unlike Laika, they were just going to space in a straight line and then fall back with a parachute. After that, Americans were also analyzing how monkeys behave in space. They sent 6 monkeys, all named Albert with a number. The Albert from 1st to 5th didn't survive the flight. Albert 6th was the only one to survive the flight itself, but he died shortly after. We've discussed how the problem was looking in the USA. Let's now focus on the USSR's part. The most important person when we talk about Soviet space program is Sergei Korolev. He was thrown into a special gulag, allowing him to continue his work as a plane designer in 1938 and brought back so he could work in better conditions in 1934 when Stalin needed him to build more weapons against the Germans. He would soon become the most important member of the Soviet Soyuz program, and his data was so protected, even his workers would have to call him the chief designer for the most of his life. But back to the spaceflight. You see, when von Braun and his crew escaped Peenemünde, they've hidden a lot of materials about V2 rockets in old mines and then detonated entrances. Then Americans took as many materials as they could find, as they knew these lands would soon be under Soviet rule. But they didn't find everything, and some of German scientists didn't make it to America as well. Those materials and the testimony of those men were studied and intended the Soviet space program. In America, all men worked together on the same goal they've been told. In Soviet Union, they were telling what they wanted to do, and if Commission said yes, then they were free to do it. One of those men was Korolev. After studying von Braun's V2, he built an improved version he called R-1, the first ever Soviet ballistic rocket, with a range of 270 kilometers and able to achieve speeds of 1.5 km per second. And then its successor, R-2, with much larger fuel tanks, allowing it to fly 600 kilometers. He continued to improve his rockets until he made R-7, about which I was talking earlier. How did he get approved by the Commission? He told them that he's able to put a satellite into orbit before the Americans. At first he wanted to put a satellite filled with a lot of scientific components, but he realized that this way he could lose the race into space. So he got another idea. Let's send there a metal ball with a transmitter, so everyone can hear that the communists were the first to be in space. You see those 4 long arms? Those are antennas emitting the signal to Earth so everyone with a radio can hear it. Hear the signal of the first man-made satellite sent into space on October 4th, 1957, not by Americans, but the Soviets. And hearing how much people liked that, Commission ordered Korolev to continue, but this time with a much bigger mission. A mission of sending the first living being into an orbit. And that's how Laika's got to orbit on November 3rd the same year. But for Americans, it was a clear signal. The Soviets wanted to put a man into space. And that would be unacceptable for them. But they had to work fast. On December 6, 1957, the first American satellite, Vanguard TV3, was meant to be sent to space with the Vanguard rocket. Of course, they could have asked von Braun to do that for America, but as I said earlier, he was just a Nazi. He's here only to build as weapons. They needed real Americans to build a real American rocket. But then this happened.
他はともかく爆裂魔法のことに関しては私は誰にも負けたくないのですエクセプロージョン
And after that, magically, they recognized von Braun as the real American they were talking about. The Americans started the Mercury program, the target sending the first man to space before the Soviets. But they couldn't just take a rocket and send a living being into space. They needed more research, and to do this on the 29th of July 1958, a new organization was formed. An organization with the target of making America the #1 in space. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration was formed, or NASA in short. They had to work fast, so they made their logo blue, the color of the fastest thing in the universe. In 1959, the Soviets sent the first spacecraft to crash into the moon, Luna 1, but NASA worked hard, and in 1961 everything was ready. The US government and von Braun decided to make one last test flight without humans on board, before sending Alan Shepard, who was intended to be the first person in space. On January 31st, 1961, the Redstone Rocket 2 mission took place. Dave sent a chimpanzee named Ham into space. Ham was lifted 253 kilometers above the Earth, and he has fallen back on a parachute. But after the mission, there were some problems. The spacecraft landed 96 kilometers away from the closest rescue ship and was sinking. It was found 30 minutes after landing by a plane. They asked the US Navy for a helicopter to take the capsule out of the water. When they finally did, Ham was safe and happily accepted an apple and half of an orange. The US was ready to put a man into space. The date of launch was set on May, and the name of the astronaut was chosen as well. But something terrible for Americans has happened. On the 12th of April 1961, the first man in history was sent in space and circled this world. What's so scary about it? That the name of the astronaut wasn't Alan Shepard, but Yuri Gagarin. Doesn't sound too American, does it? When he flew above the heads of all people on Earth, the whole of America was asleep. In the middle of the night, Shepard got a call. When he found out about what has just happened, he was shocked. He had just one thought in his head. I could have been there 3 weeks ago. Shepard, as planned, was sent into space shortly after, but unlike Gagarin, he didn't orbit the Earth, but flew in almost a straight line and then fell back. After that, Americans realized that if they want to once again be the number one in the world, they have to do something much more amazing than all of the missions they've ever sent to space.
First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Now you may wonder, why didn't the Americans simply change the date of their launch to be faster than the Soviets? The answer is that NASA shared all of the information with the public.
Achoo! How did it make you feel?
While in Soviet Union, it looked more like this.
So, how did your test go?
Well, the rocket has fallen and destroyed the entire village, killing 237 people. But it flew half a kilometer higher than the last one.
Perfect! Continue work, comrade. The publicity doesn't have to know about everything.
Отлично! Vodka?
Da.
Then Kennedy announced to the world that he's going to land men on the moon before the end of the decade. No one wanted to believe him. They didn't take him seriously. But the space race didn't slow down for a moment. On the 16th of June 1963, the USSR sent the first woman into space, Valentina Tereshkova. On the 18th of March 1965, Alexei Leonov became the first man to perform a spacewalk. No, moonwalk! A spacewalk! That is when an astronaut leaves his ship and in spacesuit drifts in the vacuum of space! But the Americans weren't so far from them, and Ed White performed the first American spacewalk on the 3rd of June the same year.
Germany 401 Capcom. So we just had word from Houston. We're ready to have you get out whenever you're ready. Okay, I'm separated from the spacecraft. Okay, my feet are out. I think I'm dragging a little bit, so I don't want to fire the gun yet. Okay, I'm out.
The first American orbital flight. Mentioned earlier, first American spacewalk. First ever meeting of two astronauts in space from other spacecrafts. And the first ever emergency landing of spacecraft during the Gemini 8 mission. One of the crew members on board of this spacecraft was Neil Armstrong, a man that will later become the first human on the surface of the moon. And this was only one out of 13 missions of the Gemini program. It was Gemini 6 and resulted in the Gemini 6A mission that, unlike the previous one, was successful. It became clear Kennedy, assassinated in 1963, didn't joke. As a way to pay respect to him, NASA's Launch Operations Center was renamed to Kennedy Space Center. The successor of Gemini program was Program Apollo. The main objective? Place a man onto the surface of the moon. Now it was no longer a space race where two superpowers were fighting over satellites on orbit. The moon race began. A team of experts from now on have to work on a giant capable of sending people to the moon. The head of the operation is none other than Werner von Braun once again. Meanwhile, the Soviets try to build their own moon rocket called N1. On the 27th of January 1967, the first Apollo mission took place. The goal was to send the first crew of new program into space. However, something went wrong. Due to the damage of command service module, fire took place and the lives of all 3 crew members were lost. One of them was Edward H. White, the first American astronaut to perform a spacewalk. It was clear NASA needed more time to improve their spacecraft, but their death wasn't for nothing. On November 9th the same year, Apollo 4 took off from the ground and resulted in the first flight of the new rocket, Saturn V, a giant that will soon take the astronauts to the moon. The first moon mission, Apollo 8, took place from December 31st to December 27th, 1968. But it didn't land. It only circled the moon. Apollo 11 was to be the first ever mission with the goal of setting foot onto the moon itself. And so it was. Started on July 16, 1969 and ended 8 days later. Apollo 11 was the first ever mission to bring humans to the moon. It carried 3 crew members: Michael Collins, who stayed inside the commander's service module, orbiting the moon and waiting for the rest to come back, Buzz Aldrin, and the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, the author of the words,
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I'd love to tell you about how Saturn V works, but it would take way too much time. And I'll certainly do a video about moon landing itself, and if I already did, the link should be right here. So for now, let's say that the mission was a great success and resulted in total of 6 landing modules and 12 people on the surface of the moon. Fun fact! Due to radiation, the color of the flag left there changed to white. That makes the moon an official colony of France. Journalists were talking about future civilization on Moon and Mars. Von Braun started creating plans for a Mars rocket. But after that, tensions between superpowers decreased. On April 19, 1971, USSR sent the first space station into orbit, followed by the USA doing the same in 1973. And in 1975, something earlier considered as impossible took place. 2 space stations, one American and a Soviet one, met in orbit. A Soviet astronaut slowly opened the door to the spacecraft, and soon after, he gathered an American astronaut with a handshake somewhere above East Germany. It was a symbolic end to the war in the skies, and the beginning of a great cooperation. As they separated and were flying away from each other, the Soviet astronauts heard strange noises from the radio. They heard a woman cheering and people having fun, and when they asked, "What is this?" the Americans replied, "A party. We're after work, so we're having a party." Later they found out that Americans recorded a party on Earth and then played it on the radio. The same year, European Space Agency. After tensions between nations decreased, America had a new goal. This time it was to make space exploration cheaper and more available. They wanted to send people to space at any time they wanted to cheaply send satellites to orbit, and what's most important, they wanted a reusable spacecraft that will safely return to Earth after the mission and be capable of being sent again to space. The idea engineers came up with is pretty amazing. The Space Transportation System, official name of the Space Shuttle, starts as a rocket with 2 solid rocket boosters and a massive orange fuel tank. Do you see it? Look, it's here. After that, Shuttle acts like a space station, only to land on a runway like a plane. It can send 8 astronauts and 23 tons of payload to low Earth's orbit. In 1972, the project formally started. It resulted in the first of 6 space shuttle, Enterprise, built in 1976 and launched on the 18th of February 1977. But Enterprise wasn't a real space shuttle. It was just a glider elevated by a specially adapted Boeing 747. You know, it wasn't called Jumbo Jet because of nothing. But thanks to Enterprise, NASA could build 5 more, this time space-ready: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. From 1981 to 2011, the space shuttles made 134 successful launches and failed only once. But it was a tragic failure. It was the 28th of September 1986. The Challenger was about to make his 25th flight and the 10th of the new program. Probably the most important person on board was Krista McAfee. She was a teacher with the goal of performing the first ever lesson from space. But of course she couldn't do it without the help of other astronauts: Michael John Smith, Francis Scope, Ronald McNair, Alison Anzuka, Gregory Jarvis, Judith Renzik. The start was meant to take place a day earlier, when the weather was good, but because of an issue with the entrance hatch, scientists decided to do it the next day. It was a horrible idea. It was really cold and there was ice everywhere. But because the flight already was delayed and NASA was afraid to lose their funding, they've decided to do the flight anyway. It was only one engineer, Robert Eblick, who said that rubber seals connecting parts of the solid-fueled rocket would freeze and lose their functionality. No one listened. He was furious. When he got back home, his wife asked him what happened. He said, "Nothing, only the fact that launch will take place and 7 people will die." As I said, the flight was the 10th out of the new program and was meant to take the first teacher to space. Basically everyone in America was watching the show live on TV when this happened. This event to this day is known as the Challenger disaster. The other 134 launches were successful, but there were only 133 successful landings. On January 16, 2003, Columbia Space Shuttle began its last trip to space. A piece of the tank's protective sponge broke away and hit the spacecraft's heat shield. This fact wasn't noticed. Even when the scientists found out, they didn't think it caused too much damage. On the 1st of February 2003, Columbia gets back to Earth. The broken heat shield couldn't withstand the hot plasma and dispersed in atmosphere. Once again, NASA has forever lost 7 of its astronauts. Soon after that, the Soviets built their own version of the space shuttle, called Buran. Even if it has started only once, they've also built a giant plane, AN-225, just to carry the Buran everywhere in the Soviet Union. It's to this day the biggest aircraft ever created. However, the Soviet Union dissolved a few years later, turning Americans into the winners of the moon race and also the Cold War. Today Russia continues the projects of the former USSR with their space agency, Roscosmos. As you can see, in this video I focused mostly on the space race and the rivalry between the USA and USSR. However, I think there is another region I should cover, even if they won't teach you about it in high school. I'm talking about Asia, most accurately about China, Japan, and India. Don't expect great leaps of science and discoveries from them, as they are relatively new to space. So I'll cover just the most important parts and go more in depth in other videos. Firstly, I want to cover Japan. Why is it so? Japan is the 4th country ever to have their own space rocket, behind the USSR, USA and France. Even though they've been working on literally pencil-sized rockets since 1955, their first grand success took place in 1970 when they put the first Japanese satellite, Oshiumi, into orbit using the Lambda 4S rocket. Then they focused on telecommunication, meteorological, broadcasting and navigation satellites. And in 1985 they sent the Sakikake probe that was the first one ever to fly by the Halley's Comet. Japanese astronauts flew in space shuttle missions and built new rockets like H2 in 1994. They are using it to this day. They helped with construction of the International Space Station and created the Kibo module that was connected in 2009. In 2003 they sent to space the Hayabusa probe that reached the planetoid 25143 Itokawa in middle September of 2005. At first, the Japanese space program was realized by the National Space Development Agency, National Aerospace Laboratory of Japan, and Institute of Space and Aeronautical Science, but in 2003 they united into the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. In 1962, the Indian National Committee for Space Research was created, but in 1969 they changed the name to the Indian Space Research Organization that we know today. They launched the first satellite in 1975 with the help of Soviet Union. It was called Aryabhata after one of the best Indian mathematicians and astronomers. The Indians built the satellite and the Soviets put it in orbit. It took Indians 5 years to develop their own rocket, the Indian Satellite Launch Vehicle. Satellite Rohini was the first thing launched without any exterior help. The Indian Space Research Organization, the Indian Satellite Launch Vehicle. The only more creative slogan was probably made by Volkswagen. And remember when I said that those nations didn't have any super advanced achievements? Well, maybe Indians weren't the first on the moon, but they were the first to discover water on it with the Chandrayaan-1 mission in 2008. In 2013, they sent their first probe to Mars with the Magellan mission, and they reached the Red Planet in a single attempt. It became the fourth space agency in the world to reach it, and the first in Asia. India went from a poor post-British colony to one of the major powers in space exploration. The last space program I'd like to tell you about belongs to China, and its CNSA agency. It was created in 1993 when the Ministry of Aerospace Industry was split into CNSA and the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. First, China's attempts to go into space began in the 1950s, when during Korean War, the US General Douglas MacArthur wanted to nuke China. Mao Zedong, the dictator of China, wanted his own intercontinental nuclear weapon. Then, in the late 1960s, when Americans and Soviets tried to land on the moon, China decided it didn't want to stay behind and created Shangong-1, the first Chinese attempt to send a man into space. But because of rocket failures and a lot of complicated stuff like the death of Mao, the first Chinese man flew into space in 2003. But since then, China has made a lot of achievements, and now it's one of the space superpowers. After the USSR collapsed, the space race was no more. This empty vacuum surrounding everything in the universe. So empty, yet so amazing, inspiring and astonishing, finally could be properly researched, not for military use or to show dominance, but to be used for the benefit of all people on Earth. In 1993, the representatives of 16 nations gathered together to create something new. This time, not as enemies, but as partners. The most expensive project of all time, with a price over 150 billion US dollars. The International Space Station, or ISS. Its history is really complicated, so I encourage you to read about it in your spare time. What you need to know about the ISS is that it's about 110 meters wide and 75 meters long. Objects that big cannot be sent to space by any modern rocket. So, how did they send the ISS to space? In modules that had to be connected to each other in space, flying about 400 kilometers above Earth at a speed of 7.5 kilometers per second. The first module, Russian Zarya, was sent to space in 1998 and provides electricity to the station. The same year, it connected to the first American module called Unity. Today the ISS is divided into the Russian orbital segment and the United States orbital segment. It took more than 10 years to finish the station. It provides us with knowledge about behavior of life in space, fluid mechanics, and much more. The crew usually consists of 6 people in 6-month-long rotations. As of the 1st of March 2021, there are 7 people on board, and soon the first year-long rotation will happen. In 2001, the space station visited the first ever space tourist, American millionaire Dennis Tito. You might be wondering, how are supplies delivered to the space station? Well, it used to be sent there with space shuttles, but since the last space shuttle flight took place on the 11th of July 2011, NASA had to find a new way to send them. They've decided to take a different strategy. Instead of designing a new spacecraft, they created a competition for private space agency for a new type of rocket that will send supplies to the ISS. The competition was won by one of the greatest space agencies of the world. The first winner was Orbital ATK. The second one, SpaceX. Okay, so that would be all for. Certainly, we live in an interesting era, with constant changes, and we're the ones that will watch how humanity became the first interplanetary civilization in this part of the universe. I hope you enjoyed this video, but all of this was a really big oversimplification of events. I could do a 10 minutes video about every rocket, satellite or space program themselves, and as I was saying, I will try to do more videos about space exploration as I love this topic. And one thing is sure, we aren't going to just sit down and stay here. Space, prepare yourself. Humanity is coming. And of course, don't forget about the most important thing about the space exploration, an ability to create a beautiful space montages.
Ignition sequence start. All engines are running.
We have taken tremendous steps.
We choose to go to the moon before this decade is out.
We have achieved the earth-shaking, the breathtaking, the groundbreaking,
One small step for man.
and left a mark in the heavens. Our successes build one upon another and amplify what is possible.
The dawn of Orion.
It's time we take the next great leap.
Dobra. Poszedł sobie. Jestem tutaj więziony, pomocy. Siedzę tu od tygodnia, każe mi ciągle ustawiać mu fokus. Pomocy, błagam. Uratujcie mnie z tej piwnicy, proszę. O nie, nadchodzi.